Chapter 4. Joe turned when he heard the door open behind him. "Wow," he said, "you look amazing." Lucy blushed and grinned. She was rather impressed with her appearance. Kia had rubbed coloured mud into her skin too, and she had turned a deep bronze. Her black wig was longer than Joe's, and some of the braids were interwoven with different coloured threads. Her lips were outlined in dark blood red, a colour her mum would never have let her wear. And she was wearing a pair of long jangling earrings, which would also have been forbidden in the Turnbull household. Lucy was beginning to enjoy herself. She twirled in a circle. "It's just like being on a movie set," she cried, as her jewellery jingled in proper Egyptian fashion. "Sort of," replied Joe. He wasn't enjoying himself at all. While Lucy was having her Egyptian makeover done, he had time to think. It might seem like they were part of a movie set, but they weren't. Thousands of years away from their own time, with no idea how to get home. "Look," Joe pointed out of the window. "That's where we're going. Back explained it all to me." Lucy shuffled across the room in her curling silver sandals. Through the window, she saw a huge crowd of people standing on the far bank of the river. They were watching a gold boat with a blue and red sail make its way towards them. "That boat is carrying Tutankhamun's body," said Joe. "Well, not his body exactly. It's been preserved." "Back told me." "I know," interrupted Lucy. "The body's a mummy." Joe smiled uneasily. "I always thought a mummy was some kind of joke." "What, like time travel, you mean?" said Lucy. Heavy perfume wafted into the room. It was strong and smelt like sweet, dark honey. The high priestess stood in the doorway. Her eyes were bigger and blacker. Her cheeks looked hollower and her lips were a slash of scarlet. She had changed from her white robe and was now dressed entirely in gold. "You must join the procession," she said in her deep, echoing voice. "Our king has waited long enough." Lucy and Joe had never felt so hot and thirsty in all their lives. They had walked for what seemed like hours in the long, winding procession behind the king's coffin. The sandals that had looked so gorgeous had rubbed blisters on their feet, and the gold jewellery was heavy and burning hot against their skin. Beside them, Back and Kia walked in silence, keeping their eyes on the huge stone temple ahead. The sound of thousands of shuffling feet and the continuous wailing of the mourners filled Lucy's head like a swarm of bees. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe through the cotton of her dress. The air was choking with dust and incense. Suddenly, everything began to spin. "Joe," she croaked, "I think I'm going to—" And the next moment she was in Back's arms and a sharp-tasting liquid was running down her throat. "You cannot fall," said Back urgently. "It will be an insult to the gods." Lucy felt a piece of sticky gum being pressed into her mouth. It tasted bitter but not unpleasant. "Chew this," said Back. "It will revive you." "Lucy! Lucy!" It was Joe's voice. "Are you all right?" He sounded on the verge of tears. "What did you give her?" he shouted at Back. "A medicine of my father's," replied Back. "My father is a physician in the court," he added in a slightly stiffer voice. "It's working," whispered Lucy to Joe. "I'll be all right." Back took Lucy's arm and half carried her forward. "I will help you," he said. Joe looked at Lucy. Her eyes said, "Leave me, don't worry." And he dropped back to Kia's side. In front of them, a huge triangle of yellow stone blocked out the sky. The sun rested on top of it like a decoration on a Christmas tree. "Soon the sun will fall behind the great tomb," said Kia. Kia was right. Half an hour later, they were walking in pale purple shadows, and it was cooler. But now there was a different feeling in the funeral procession. Everyone knew that the time for the king's final journey was almost upon them. Joe moved up to Lucy's side. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them could speak. They also felt the change in the crowd, and one single question loomed in their minds. How were they going to get home? A wave of homesickness washed over Lucy, and her eyes filled with tears. "Don't be sad," said Back, seeing the tears run down Lucy's cheeks. "Now the God King will live forever, and all your struggles will be over." Joe's stomach turned to ice. "What do you mean, our struggles?" A terrible thought flashed through Lucy's mind. Was this the mysterious part of their mission? Are we to be buried with him?" she almost screamed. As Back opened his mouth, the wailing soared to an ear-splitting scream. The procession had arrived at the funerary temple in the shadow of the Great Pyramid. "Back!" cried Joe. "You have to tell us." The crowd roared and rose like a huge howling whirlpool. Back and Kia were swallowed into it. To their horror, Joe and Lucy found themselves on their own in front of the temple, staring at the carved gold coffin of Tutankhamun. A deep voice like the howl of a wolf rose from the shadows of the temple's entrance. "It is the gods' will that Tutankhamun's bow and arrow be returned to his side." Underneath the mud that coloured their faces, Joe and Lucy went white. The bow and arrow! They'd forgotten about them. Lucy turned to Joe, shaking. "Where did we leave them?" "In the painted box," whispered Joe. Lucy was forcing herself to think. If the bow and arrow had brought them here, somehow the bow and arrow must be part of their journey back. If they gave up the bow and arrow, they would never get home. "Oh, don't say anything," hissed Lucy. "We need them." Strong hands gripped their arms. It was Priest Irie. "I have the bow and arrow," he whispered. "I will give them to you, and you will give them to the High Priestess." Lucy felt sick as the smooth wood of the bow was pressed into her hand. "If we give her these," she croaked, "we will be stranded here forever." "If you do not, you will die," replied the priest. "So how can we get home?" said Joe. His voice was raw and angry. "Or do we die anyway?" "It is not written," replied Irie. "So what is written?" asked Joe rudely. "The bow and arrow must rest with Tutankhamun," explained Irie. "He wants your happiness, not your sadness." "But if the bow is with Tutankhamun and the tomb is sealed," cried Lucy, "how can we get back?" "You will hide in the shadows and wait for the cat. Follow him. Your way home is painted in pictures." "The cat has deserted us," shouted Joe. "He left when—" There was the crash of a huge cymbal. It was an angry, impatient noise. "Trust me." Irie looked deep into Lucy's eyes. "Trust me," he pleaded, "and see who I am. There is no more time." Lucy stared back at his strange yellow eyes. They were cat's eyes.